and slid back down the hill, we counted the living, patched the wounded, and braced for the next. That night, you never forget the sound of boots crunching toward a fight that no one believes they'll survive. My name is Captain James Walker, Infantry 77th Division, Korea, winter of 1952. This isn't a story about glory. It's about one man, Sergeant Harlow, a man who taught us what defiance looks like when the odds have already chosen the ending. The hill we were ordered to hold didn't have a name, just a number on the map, Hill 49. Wind-blasted, frostbitten, scarred by shell craters. We were sent there to slow the enemy's advance until artillery could reposition. Command said 2 days. We knew 2 hours would be generous. Our platoon was down to 23 men, most of them kids wrapped in oversized coats, fingers too stiff to work the triggers of their rifles. We carried M1 Garands, a single Browning machine gun that jammed whenever the barrel got too cold, and 3 boxes of mortar rounds already half spent. No one told us why we had to hold Hill 49. We just knew that if the hill fell, the road behind us would fall next. I still remember the first night. The snow came sideways, needling our faces raw. The sky was the color of dirty steel, and the wind howled like it was trying to rip the hill out from under us. We dug in, foxholes hacked from frozen dirt, sandbags stiff as boards. Harlow went from hole to hole, checking each man's position, not barking orders, just steady, calm, the way you talk to a horse that's about to bolt. He wasn't the loudest. He wasn't the friendliest, but there was something in his voice that said, "Stand your ground, I'll stand with you." I think that's why the boys trusted him more than they trusted me, their own captain. By the second day, the shelling started. Not the usual scattered bursts. This was measured, deliberate. Rounds walked across the slope, stitching the hill from left to right, driving us deeper into the holes we dug. When the shelling paused, we heard the whistles of enemy officers and the crunch of boots in the snow below. They were coming. I crawled down the trench to Harlow's hole. His helmet was dusted white, his eyes calm as if he'd been expecting them. "They'll hit the center first," he said. I asked how he knew. He nodded toward the smoldering wreck of our Browning nest. "They saw us lose the gun. They'll think that's their gap." He was right. Minutes later, the first wave hit. Dark shapes climbing through the snow, rifles flashing, shouts carried by the wind. We fired until our fingers went numb. Men slipped, fell, scrambled back to their holes only to fire again. Somehow we held. When the wave broke and slid back down the hill, we counted the living, patched the wounded, and braced for the next. That night, the cold cut deeper than the bullets. One of the kids, Private Ellis, cried quietly into his scarf. Harlow sat beside him, handed over his own last cigarette, and said, "Smoke it slow. Pretend it's spring." For a few minutes, Ellis stopped shaking. Looking back now, I think we all knew how that hill would end. But no one, least of all me, knew that Harlow would become the man who walked straight into fire and never looked back. Dawn on the third day came without warmth. The sky was low and gray. The snow crusted hard enough to scrape the skin off your knuckles if you brushed it wrong. We had lost 2 men in the night, not to bullets, but to the cold. Frostbite turned to fever. Fever turned to silence. War doesn't care how it takes you. The enemy waited until the sun was a dull coin behind the clouds before starting again. Mortars first. Slow, steady, deliberate. Each shell slammed into the slope with a hollow thud that you felt in your teeth before you heard it in your ears. We huddled low in the foxholes, helmets rattling as chunks of frozen dirt rained down. Every few minutes a man would curse under his breath, not at the enemy, but at the cold that made his trigger finger sluggish. When the barrage stopped, Harlow crawled to my hole, grinning as if we were sharing a private joke. "Captain," he said, "they're trying to wear us down before dark. They think we'll be too frozen to fight tonight." He had a way of speaking as if he'd already read the other side's playbook. It was hard not to believe him. A runner brought word that our ammunition resupply had been delayed again. Roads were iced over, trucks bogged down miles to the rear. We were down to a handful of mortar rounds, 1 belt for the Browning, and whatever each man still had in his Garand clips, the kind of math that keeps a commander awake long after the shells go quiet. Late that afternoon, we saw them moving again. Shapes in the snow below, shifting in the tree line like shadows cut loose from their owners. The first shots cracked across the slope, echoing against the frozen hillside. We answered back, measured and slow, trying not to waste a round. Our breath came in sharp white bursts, drifting like smoke above the foxholes. One of the kids, Private Mendez, flinched with every shot, whispering prayers between trigger pulls. Harlow moved along the line, kneeling beside each man long enough to offer a nod, a word, a hand on the shoulder. He wasn't giving speeches, just making sure no one felt invisible. By the time he reached Mendez, the boy's breathing had steadied. That was Harlow's gift. He made you believe you could last one more hour. By nightfall, the attacks eased, but not the cold. The wind howled through the broken sandbags and made the lantern flames dance like nervous hearts. We set watches 2 at a time so that no one froze alone. I sat awake through most of it, listening to the ice crack in the timber of the trench walls, wondering how many more nights the hill could hold. Around midnight, I found Harlow sitting on an ammo crate near the half-buried Browning. His helmet sat in his lap, his hair stiff with frost. "Sir," he said, "if we get pushed off this hill, you know we won't be the first to run." I told him we weren't running. He smiled. Not like he believed me, but like he respected the answer. That was the last quiet conversation we ever had. None of us knew that before the next sunset, Harlow would make a choice that would burn itself into every man's memory, a choice that would make his name live far longer than the hill we nearly lost. The next morning began with smoke, not sunrise. A fire had started somewhere down in the woods, probably from one of the night flares that burned itself into a dead pine. The haze clung to the slope, stinging our eyes, mixing with the frost until it felt like breathing through damp ashes. We were running low on everything: ammo, water, even hope. The medic's kit was down to a single roll of gauze and a vial of morphine. The men had stopped asking about resupply. That silence was worse than the questions. Around mid-morning, the enemy probed again. This time they came in small bursts, 2 or 3 men at a time, slipping between the tree trunks like they were part of the forest itself. We shot when we could see them, but most of the time we were firing at shadows. The crack of rifles and the short, sharp cough of the Browning echoed up and down the hill until the sound felt like it lived in our bones. Harlow was everywhere at once. He helped Mendez clear a jammed clip, then scrambled over to drag Sergeant Keller out of a trench that had half collapsed under mortar fire. Each time he moved, he left a line of footprints that filled with snow almost as soon as he passed. It was like the hill itself was trying to erase him even before the fight was done. By noon, the snow turned to a hard sleet that rattled on helmets and froze the surface of the foxholes. Our radio batteries were dying from the cold and the handset barely carried static. I remember thinking the weather was finishing the job the mortars had started. When the next barrage hit, it came without warning. The first shell landed so close that it lifted 2 men into the air and dropped them back like rag dolls. The shockwave punched the breath out of my chest and left my ears ringing. Before we could recover, another round struck the edge of our trench line, collapsing a section and burying Private Yates to the waist. 3 of us clawed through frozen dirt to pull him free, our gloves stiff with ice and blood. Through all of it, Harlow stayed steady. No panic, no shouting. He just moved to wherever things were worst, like he had a compass that pointed toward danger. Once, as he passed me a fresh magazine, he said with that faint grin, "Sir, if they keep this up, we'll run out of hill before we run out of fight." In the afternoon, we spotted figures massing in the timber below, using the haze as cover. Dozens at first, then more. The kind of slow, deliberate buildup that tells you the next push isn't another probe. It's the real thing. We scrambled to shift what was left of our ammo to the forward foxholes. Harlow volunteered to run the belts for the Browning himself, sprinting through sleet and shrapnel as the first shells started to fall again. He moved low, fast, his shoulders hunched against the wind, snow streaking his parka white. The men watched him the way you watch a man carrying your last hope. Even the kids who'd been too green to respect anyone started to straighten their backs when he passed. That night, as darkness settled over the ridge like a lid, we could hear the enemy digging in closer, their shovels biting at the frozen ground. Each scrape sounded like a countdown. We all knew the next assault would come before dawn. And Harlow, he stood at the edge of the trench, staring down into the black woods as if he could already see the fire waiting for him. He didn't say a word, but his silence felt heavier than any speech. The hours before an attack are often worse than the attack itself. That night the air was thick with the smell of wet pine and scorched earth from the fires burning down the slope. The sky above us glowed faintly orange, as if the clouds themselves were smoldering. We could hear them digging, scraping at the frozen ground somewhere just out of sight. Every few minutes a spade struck a rock and the sound carried up the ridge like the ticking of a clock we didn't want to reach zero. We tried to keep busy, patching torn sandbags, checking weapons again and again even though we knew they were clean. Anything to avoid sitting still with our thoughts. The medic, Corporal Benton, made rounds with what little morphine he had left, saving it for the worst of the wounded. The rest of us just shivered in the trenches, huddled beneath our helmets, trying not to think about the hours ahead. Harlow sat a few feet away from me, elbows on his knees, staring into the darkness below. His rifle rested across his lap. His face was calm, but too calm, like a man who had already decided something the rest of us hadn't yet realized. I remember leaning over to him and whispering, "Think we'll hold?" He didn't look at me. He just said, "We'll hold till we can't." Then he went back to watching the tree line as if it might tell him the future. Around midnight, the wind shifted and carried with it the faint murmur of voices. Not ours. Not English. They were close enough to hear but too far to understand. A few of the men gripped their rifles tighter, fingers brushing triggers. But Harlow only tilted his head, listening like he was memorizing their rhythm. At 2 in the morning, the cold grew so sharp it felt like it was cutting through our coats. Frost formed on the rims of the foxholes, sparkling faintly whenever a flare went up in the distance. For a brief moment, the hillside looked almost beautiful, like a snow globe before the glass shatters. Then we heard the first mortar being set into its base plate, a hollow thump that rolled up the ridge like distant thunder. The men around me stiffened, but no one spoke. We all knew what came next. Harlow stood and slung his rifle over his shoulder. He moved along the trench, crouching to check each position. When he stopped by Private Mendez, who was barely 19 and shaking so hard his teeth chattered, he rested a hand on the kid's shoulder and said, "Keep your head low and breathe. That's all you have to do right now, breathe." When he reached me, he asked if the Browning had enough belts loaded. I nodded. He gave a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes, and said, "Good. We'll need every round before the night's done." Not long after, the first shell landed 50 yards down the slope, throwing up a fountain of mud and slush. The second fell closer. By the third, the earth itself seemed to shake with each blast. Screams and splintered wood filled the air. Men huddled deeper into the trenches, helmets rattling from the shockwaves. Through it all, Harlow moved like a shadow, keeping men steady, hauling sandbags, even pulling Benton out of the path of a collapsing parapet. He never flinched, never cursed, just kept going. By dawn, the enemy's guns went silent, replaced by the low moan of the wind dragging smoke across the ridge. We thought the worst had passed, but as the light crept over the blackened trees below, we saw movement. Lines of men advancing through the haze. Slow, steady, relentless. That was when I realized the night hadn't been the battle. It had only been the drumbeat before the charge. At sunrise, the ridge looked like the mouth of a furnace. The low ground below us was a sea of smoke, hiding the movement of the men coming through it. Every few seconds, the haze thinned enough to show dark shapes. Helmets, bayonets, rifles raised high. Before the wind closed the curtain again, Harlow crouched at the center of the line, resting the stock of his M1 Garand against his knee. He wasn't speaking. He was just watching. Some men prayed under their breath. Others clenched their jaws, eyes fixed on the wire strung along the forward slope. The first wave hit just as the sun climbed over the ridgeline. Machine gun fire tore across the slope, cutting into the smoke. The enemy came on anyway, stumbling, falling, getting back up. A mortar shell slammed into the trench to my left, blowing a wall of dirt and snow over us. I ducked, ears ringing, vision flashing white, and came up spitting mud. Harlow's voice cut through the chaos. "Keep your heads low. Fire in short bursts. Make every round count." His tone was calm, deliberate, even as rounds cracked overhead and ricocheted off the frozen parapet. Mendez, the youngest in the squad, froze when his rifle jammed. Harlow slid over, shoved a fresh clip into the kid's weapon, and shoved him back into the fight. "Breathe, son. Breathe and squeeze," he said, like a coach at a firing line instead of a soldier knee-deep in blood and ice. By mid-morning, the slope was littered with bodies, dark against the frost. We were down to 2 belts for the Browning and barely 3 clips each for the Garands. Our water froze in the canteens. The wounded moaned quietly, trying not to draw fire. A lull settled over the ridge around noon, the smoke drifting apart to reveal the enemy regrouping in the tree line below. We could see them moving stretchers, hear the distant bark of orders. It should have been comforting to know they'd paid a price too. It wasn't. It only meant they were preparing for another push. Harlow crouched beside me, chewing a piece of frozen bread like it was a luxury. "You watch," he said softly. "They'll come again before dusk. That's when they always come. When the cold starts stealing the trigger from your fingers." He wasn't wrong. We didn't even have an hour before the next wave surged forward. More mortars, more smoke. The ridge shuddered under the impact, the sandbags spilling loose dirt over the wounded. We fired until the barrels smoked in the sub-zero air. When the second wave finally broke, the trench smelled of gunpowder, sweat, and frozen blood. Half our line was bleeding. Most of us were shaking from exhaustion and cold. And still Harlow kept moving down the trench, patting shoulders, lifting chins, repeating the same quiet phrase to anyone who met his eyes. "Hold the line. We've come too far to give it back now." I think that was the moment I understood what kind of man he was. Not the sort who lived for orders or medals or speeches. The sort who believed that if the world was going to fall apart, you stood where you were and held it together for as long as you could. But as the sun sank behind the ridge line and the long shadows crept across the battlefield, I saw the look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. It wasn't fear. It was the look of a man measuring the cost and realizing he was about to pay it. Night fell heavy and fast. The cold crept in until it felt like our bones were freezing from the inside out. We barely had the strength to reload, yet none of us dared to rest. The ridge had gone eerily quiet again, and we all knew what that meant. Harlow stood at the edge of the trench, a dark figure against the thin moonlight. His breath showed in pale clouds each time he exhaled. He looked like he was carved out of the hill itself, unmoving, watchful, carrying the weight for all of us. The silence broke when the first flare hissed into the sky, painting everything below in a harsh white glare. In that flash we saw them again, lines of figures advancing in a low crouch, rifles at the ready. The flare burned out and dropped, plunging the battlefield back into shadows. "Positions!" Harlow called. His voice was steady, no hint of panic, even though the next flare went up almost immediately and revealed the enemy much closer than before. The first gunfire came from their side. Bullets cracked past our helmets, snapping chips of ice from the trench wall. We returned fire, the muzzles sparking orange against the darkness. The smell of cordite and frozen earth mixed into something that clung to the throat. A mortar shell landed short but close enough to rock the trench. Snow and dirt collapsed into the dugout. Mendez screamed when a splinter tore into his arm. Harlow moved to him, tied the wound with a strip of his own scarf, and shoved him back into position without a word. For hours it felt like we were fighting the darkness itself, firing at flashes, ducking at whines of bullets, never sure what we were hitting. Every so often I caught sight of Harlow moving up and down the line, shouting corrections, clapping shoulders. His voice the one thing that kept us anchored. Near midnight the wind shifted. It carried with it a new smell, acrid, sharp, unmistakable. Fuel. Then came the whoosh of flame. The enemy had decided the cold wasn't killing us fast enough. They brought fire. A burst of burning liquid arced overhead and splashed into the forward trench, igniting a wall of sandbags. The flames hissed and roared, lighting up the ridge with a ghastly orange glow. Men scrambled to stamp it out with their boots, coughing on the oily smoke. Harlow didn't flinch. He grabbed the nearest canteen, dumped the frozen water over the edge, and yelled, "Keep firing, don't let them push through." His shadow danced huge against the flames, a black silhouette that looked almost inhuman. When the fire finally died down, the trench was lined with scorched sandbags and the air was thick with the smell of burned cloth. We'd held again, but barely. 2 of our own lay still under the tarp at the far end, their boots sticking out into the frost. That night none of us slept. Harlow kept watch until dawn, pacing the line with his rifle slung as if daring the darkness to try again. At first light I saw the frost glittering on his helmet and the deep lines around his mouth. He looked older than he had the day before, like the ridge itself had claimed a piece of him. I realized then that he already knew what we were only beginning to understand. This fight wasn't going to end clean. Someone was going to pay the full price before it was done. The morning we all feared came dressed in silence. No shelling, no distant shouts, only a low, biting wind that scraped across the ridge and carried the smell of ash from the night before. We ate what passed for breakfast. Hard biscuits and bitter coffee that tasted like wet earth. No one said much. Even Rodriguez, who never shut up, just stared into his tin cup like it held answers. Harlow gathered us near the burned-out sandbags. His face was gray from exhaustion, but his eyes were steady. Command says we hold one more day, that's it. We keep this ridge until sundown. Then reinforcements roll in. We just have to make it that far. He let the words hang there as if daring us to believe them. I remember thinking how strange it was that the sky looked so clear. A pale blue stretched above us, calm and cold, as if nothing terrible had ever happened under it. But every man there could feel it. The weight in the air, like the ground itself was bracing for something. Around mid-morning, we saw movement in the tree line below. At first it was just shadows slipping between the branches, then glints of steel catching the light. They were assembling quietly, deliberately. This time there would be no probing attack. This was the final push. Harlow didn't wait for orders. He moved along the line, adjusting firing arcs, checking the Browning's feed, patting shoulders as he passed. He stopped beside Mendez and tightened the strap on his helmet without a word. Little things that said more than speeches ever could. When the first mortar hit, it was like the sky had cracked open. The shell landed just short of the forward trench, spraying dirt and ice into the air. A second followed, closer. Then a third slammed into the ridge itself, collapsing part of the parapet. We scrambled to fill the gap as the enemy advanced in a gray wave through the trees. The next minutes were chaos. Shouted commands, the rattle of machine gun fire, grenades hissing into the snow and bursting in dirty clouds. The ridge shook under our boots as if the mountain wanted to throw us off. In the middle of it all, I saw Harlow standing tall at the center of the line, shouting over the thunder of gunfire. His voice cut through everything, firm, clear, steady. He called out targets, told men when to duck, when to push, when to breathe. A shell burst near the ammunition crate, scattering belts of rounds and knocking 2 men flat. Flames licked up from the splintered wood, threatening to ignite the rest. Harlow was there before anyone else, stomping the flames with his coat while bullets ripped the air around him. It felt like the fight would never end, like the ridge would burn down to stone before they stopped coming. But as the day wore on, we realized something. Their waves were thinning. We were still standing. When the last of them fell back into the tree line, silence returned. Not peaceful, but exhausted, like the land itself had spent its strength. We slumped behind the trench wall, too tired even to cheer. Harlow stayed on his feet. He stood at the edge of the ridge as the smoke drifted around him, staring down at the valley below. For the first time, I noticed his hands were trembling. That night, as we huddled against the cold, I heard him speaking softly to himself. I couldn't make out the words, but his voice was low, steady, almost like a prayer. I think that's when I knew. Harlow had already made his decision about what tomorrow would cost. The dawn of that last day was bitter cold. The sky turned pale as if even the sun was reluctant to rise over the ridge. We were half awake, half broken, waiting for the next assault. We didn't have to wait long. The enemy came again, more desperate than before, their shells pounding the ridge until the air tasted of iron and dust. Every blast shook the ground beneath us, sending small avalanches of rock tumbling down the slope. We were running low on ammunition. The radio had gone silent, either dead or cut off. It felt like the world had shrunk to that one battered ridge, the trench lines, and the cold sky above. Then a mortar shell landed short of the trench and set fire to the ammunition stockpile. Flames leapt high, licking at the stacked crates that held what little we had left. If that fire reached the powder and grenades, the entire ridge would become our grave. Harlow saw it before anyone else. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even call for help. He grabbed a half-empty water canteen, tossed his rifle aside, and sprinted straight into the flames. Bullets snapped past him, bits of dirt and snow leaping where rounds hit. He didn't slow. He ripped open the flaming crates, heaved smoldering rounds one by one down the slope, kicking others into the snow to smother the sparks. The fire roared back at him, scorching his sleeves, but he kept going. We shouted for him to get out, but the ridge was too loud for him to hear. Or maybe he didn't want to. I watched him through the haze of smoke and flying embers. In that moment, he didn't look like a man at all. He looked like something carved out of the ridge itself, unyielding, relentless, as if the fire wasn't there. By the time the flames were under control, Harlow was on his knees, coughing, his face blackened by smoke. He pushed himself upright, waved off our hands when we tried to steady him, and picked his rifle back up. He didn't say a word, but when the next wave hit, he was the first to fire. We held that ridge until nightfall. When the enemy finally retreated, the snow was streaked with soot and blood, but the ridge was still ours. We were still standing, what was left of us. Harlow never mentioned what he'd done. He never called himself a hero, never let us thank him. But none of us forgot the sight of that lone figure charging into fire because it needed to be done. Decades later, that image still visits me, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in the quiet moments when the world feels too calm. It isn't just a memory of bravery. It's a reminder of what one man's defiance can mean when everything else seems lost. If this story stayed with you, if it made you remember someone you once served with or think about the weight carried by those who never asked to be heroes, share it. Leave a comment below. And if you want to hear more voices like Harlow's, more stories from the edges of history, you know what to do.